Does God exist? Are science and faith enemies? Your host for this series was an atheist who became a believer in God through his studies in science. Here is public high school teacher John Clayton.
If you're watching this program for the first time, we would like to encourage you to go back and look at the 3 programs that have preceded this, because this is a step in a series of logical developments. We started out this series of discussions talking about the fact that there is reality. We asked, is this reality something that had a beginning, or is it something that has simply always been? Contrasting the atheist point of view with the view of those who believe in God. And we saw that the scientific evidence strongly supports the concept that there was a beginning. Then we looked at the question of, was the beginning caused or was it not caused? And we saw that to maintain that it was not caused, even if it's a process that we don't understand, ends up negating science and really sort of terminates any logical discussion. And so what we've been looking at now has been the question of, okay, if there was a beginning and if it was caused, what caused it? Was the cause an intelligence? A God? Something that demonstrated intelligence and purpose and reason and order? Or is the cosmos a product of chance? Something that happens by blind mechanistic operation that has no intelligence and no purpose and no design. And we sort of pointed out that there are notable people in the academic community who have suggested that we are the result of blind forces, that it's all a mechanical accident. And so we've been looking at what the evidence is. All of our discussion in these presentations has to do with evidence. You can argue all you want to about what might be true. You can perform all kinds of theoretical models. The question is, though, what does the evidence show? And so we have suggested that there are 4 different kinds of design that we can see in the cosmos. And in our previous video, we looked at examples of what we call intuitive design. Now, what we mean by intuitive is that these are just things that you look at and you ask yourself, is chance really a workable mechanism here? Without resorting to any high-powered mathematical discussion, without looking at any statistical analysis, without suggesting that there aren't other alternatives, just what does the evidence show? And I fully understand that people can propose models to explain these things, but we'll talk about the statistical possibility of those models later. And what I'd like to do in this particular session is to turn into another type of design that's very closely related to what we looked at in our previous discussion. And this is what I call architectural design. And what we're talking about here is the beauty and the wisdom architecturally of the creation around us. Because there are some things in the creation that exist that are just beautiful, just have incredible aesthetic beauty, which has no survival value, which has no strength value, that has no real reason to be there. And the question is this a reflection of intelligence in the creation, something that does not lend itself well to chance? Now, the first thing I think needs to be said here is that there are things in nature that show strength, wisdom in design. And an example of that might be honeycomb. I don't know whether you've ever noticed or not, but a honeycomb is 6-sided. It's a hexagon. And I don't know whether you've ever seen any of the stuff that has been done by scientists as they've looked at this or not, but the hexagon is really an incredible structure from an engineering standpoint. As you can see in this picture of honeycomb, the hexagons fit together beautifully. But what you can't see in that diagram is that the hexagon is the most beautifully designed, most exquisitely engineered geometric shape you can have for strength. You see, when you put a load in a hexagon, like honey, for example, that weight is distributed across 3 sides. It doesn't end up on the bottom. So if you were to fill this hexagon you're looking at right now on the screen with something real dense and real heavy like honey, it would hold it. On the other hand, if you were to put that honey in a triangle, and most of us probably will remember back in our geometry class being told how rigid a triangle is, the load would all be on one side and the triangle would be very likely to break. And so we use triangles sometimes in engineering structures, but they're not the best structure, especially if you are working with something where the load is distributed within the engineered structure itself, like honeycomb. So when you see honeycomb, you're looking at an exquisitely designed structure that can handle the forces, is also extremely economical to build. There is no wasted material in the construction of the honeycomb. And I think one of the questions that has to come off of an intuitive nature here is, how do the bees know to develop the honeycomb? I mean, how do you construct a trial and error system here? Let's suppose that the first bee made his honeycomb out of a rectangle or out of a triangle, and he loads it up with honey and the whole thing collapses. Scratch one bee. Who does the next experiment? I think it's difficult to construct trial and error models that work on the question of the honeycomb. But nonetheless, it's another one of those things that is intuitive in nature. And although there's architecture involved, and although we're dealing with strength and forces and the way in which things are designed, that's really not what I'm talking about when I talk about architectural design and the creation. Let me show you what I'm talking about when we deal with architectural design. Incidentally, I would like to point out to you that man copies these things in nature. We have copied the honeycomb in building wings on 747s and SSTs. We have learned that the structure that the honeycomb is made of, that the bee uses, is the very best structure to use. And so wings on these high velocity airplanes where tremendous forces are involved are constructed of honeycomb type material. And man does that many times, copying the design he sees in nature to build things of his own design. But here's what we mean by architectural design, and I'd like to give you an example of it. Back in the 13th century, there was a mathematician by the name of Fibonacci. And Fibonacci constructed what is called a Fibonacci series. Now you can see this on the screen. It's a very simple thing. In the Fibonacci series, you add one number to the next number to get the next number. So as you look at the screen, 1 plus 2 is 3, 2 plus 3 is 5, 3 plus 5 is 8, 5 plus 8 is 13, 13 plus 8 is 21, 13 plus 21 is 34, and on and on and on. You can follow the sequence across. And Fibonacci pointed out some interesting things there, that if you divide, for instance, 144 by 233, you get the number 0.618034. And if you divide 55 by 89, you get the same ratio. What's interesting about this is that architects took Fibonacci's material and they started constructing various kinds of objects, buildings, things that had particular design features. And one of the things they found was that you get what is called pleasing rectangles if you use the Fibonacci scale. So if you look at the rectangle at the bottom of the screen, you'll notice that the length and the width of it have a certain ratio. And for instance, if you made the length of the thing 13 feet and made the width of it, or the height of it as you're looking at the screen, 8 feet, you would have Fibonacci numbers, and this would be called a Fibonacci rectangle. Now, if you're like a lot of my high school students, they say, so what? Well, that leads to some interesting things. For instance, if you cut a square off a Fibonacci rectangle, what's left is another Fibonacci rectangle. Mathematicians love this kind of stuff. So you see all kinds of things written about how the Fibonacci sequence works. You can also construct what is called a Fibonacci spiral. And what architects have found is that people not only find the Fibonacci rectangle aesthetically appealing, but they also find that the spiral that you can construct off a Fibonacci rectangle is aesthetically appealing. And we build staircases out of Fibonacci spirals. We use Fibonacci spirals for decorations on things. We have all kinds of artistic things in which Fibonacci spirals have been used because people like and enjoy Fibonacci spirals. But you know who else apparently enjoys Fibonacci spirals? Apparently God does. Because the Fibonacci spiral occurs over and 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 over in nature. We see curves in nature that match the equation that you see right now on the screen. Let me give you some illustrations of this. When you go out into space and you look at a galaxy, in this picture you're looking at is a galaxy which is called a spiral galaxy. What you find is that the arms of this galaxy curve with exactly the same curvature that you saw in the Fibonacci spiral in the last frame. The mathematical equation which describes the arms of this galaxy fit the equation for the Fibonacci curve perfectly. When you look at a wave, you find that the curl of the wave matches the Fibonacci spiral perfectly. If you took a Fibonacci spiral and set it on this wave, it would fit exactly. The equation of the curve of the wave is exactly what the Fibonacci equation says. You watch water go down the drain, counterclockwise in the northern hemisphere, clockwise in the southern hemisphere. You know what the first thing I did was when I got to Australia? Yeah, went in the men's restroom, pulled the plug. Sure enough, the water went down the drain the wrong way. Well, actually, that force is too weak for that to be reliable. But nonetheless, the point is that water goes down the drain in a Fibonacci spiral. The equation describes perfectly what's happening. Now, somebody says, all right, you got a gravitational something or other going on here. No. Because when you have zero gravity, and you have subatomic particles, they curl with a Fibonacci spiral. When you balance gravity by buoyancy, like in seashells, the curve of the shell is a Fibonacci curve. The equation describes it perfectly. That's true in fossil forms. It's also true in modern living forms. As a matter of fact, in your own garden, you can go out and see Fibonacci spirals in the snails in your garden. You see Fibonacci spirals in the horns of every living thing you can imagine. All of the different animals that inhabit the earth use Fibonacci spirals for the curvature of their horns. And that's also been true in the past because fossil forms show the very same thing. When you take a look at the curl of the teeth of a groundhog, it curls with a Fibonacci spiral. When you look at the curl of the teeth of a grizzly bear, it curls with a Fibonacci spiral. When you look at the beak of every bird you can imagine, they all curl with a Fibonacci spiral. When you look at the tail of a chameleon, it curls with a Fibonacci spiral. When you look at the vines of pumpkins and potatoes and tomatoes, they all curl with a Fibonacci spiral. When you take a look at the petals of a magnolia, they curl with a Fibonacci spiral. When you look at sunflower seeds, they curl with a Fibonacci spiral. When you look at the back of a pine cone, it curls with a Fibonacci spiral. When you look at a fingerprint, the pattern of the fingerprint curls with a Fibonacci spiral. Are you picking up a pattern? Now, folks, there is no reason for this. Strength is not an issue in the examples that we've been looking at. And it's important to understand that the Fibonacci equation and spiral offers no strength advantage in any of the structures that it applies to, and strength is not an issue in those structures for the most part. And certainly this doesn't fit any Darwinian concept. How are you more fit because your fingerprint curls in a Fibonacci spiral than you would be if it didn't? What's natural selection going to work on? And the important thing to understand here is that we're just scratching the hem of the garment on this thing. We're just barely getting into the examples. There are just unlimited numbers of examples. On the floor of the ocean, there's a living thing called a Christmas tree worm, and its plankton straining mechanisms spiral up with Fibonacci spirals. The proboscis of a moth curls with a Fibonacci spiral. A spider web curls with a Fibonacci spiral. The brain has Fibonacci curvatures in it. I was giving a lecture one time, and a surgeon attended, and he came up after my presentation on this stuff, and he said, did you know that there are 26 Fibonacci spirals in the human brain? And I said, no, tell me more. He said, I'll send you a paper on it. So I get this 423-page paper with all this discussion about the curved structures and how they fit these equations in the Fibonacci equation. But the important thing to understand is this is another example of the Fibonacci spiral. Chlorella algae, inside the little algae fragments, has Fibonacci spirals. The DNA helix has a Fibonacci spiral. We see the Fibonacci spiral in the cochlea of the inner ear. We see the Fibonacci spiral in the umbilical cord of a baby. Now, once again, let me emphasize, there's no reason for this. There is no strength advantage. It does not enhance survival. There is absolutely no reason for this to exist in terms of survival value or in terms of anything involving strength. But I think there's another principle involved. You know, if you came to where I live, near South Bend, Indiana, and if I took you on a tour of the area, there's some stuff you might like to see around here. You know, the College Football Hall of Fame is in South Bend. Notre Dame, great educational institution, is in South Bend, and lots of people interested in seeing the Gold Dome and the Touchdown Jesus and all those kinds of things. I'd like to take you up to Lake Michigan to a place called Old Baldy. No, it's not named after me. It's a big sand dune, one of the biggest sand dunes in the world on a fresh body water of a lake. But one of the places I would take you is on the corner of Ridgedale and York in South Bend, Indiana. There's a house there that's just beautiful. And I happen to know a little bit about the house because I had the kids of the people that own the house in my classes at James Whitcomb Riley High School. And isn't this house beautiful? It's got this multi-tiered roof line, which is typical of this architectural design. It has little tiny windows on the north side of the house and great big picture windows on the south side of the house. So it takes maximum advantage of incoming solar radiation and utilizes all of the principles of engineering that make it possible to minimize cost in heating this house. And as you look at the house from different perspectives, you see this beautifully contrived design feature. And after you looked at it and oohed and awed with me at it a little bit, I would have told you, this house was designed by a very famous architect. His name is Frank Lloyd Wright. And because I knew the Hillman kids and was in that house, and because I had a chance to see some of this design, I got kind of interested in this stuff. I see houses all over the country that demonstrate this design. I was in Arizona one time and I went by this place and I was in a limo and I yelled at the limo driver and I said, "Hey, stop, I got to get a picture." And I jumped out and I took this picture and got back in. I said, "Man, look at that. It looks like a Frank Lloyd Wright house. Got those multi-tiered roof lines, got the big windows here, small windows." I said, that's beautiful. That's a Frank Lloyd Wright structure. And he looked at me, he said, "Well, how'd you know that? You're not from around here." I said, "I recognize the design. I was in California and went by this house. I was in a taxi cab. And I yelled at the driver, I said, "Hey, stop, I got to get a picture of that." And I jumped out and I shot this picture. I got back in the cab. I said, "Hey, look at those multiple roof lines. Look at the way these windows, hey, this looks like a Frank Lloyd Wright house." He said, "How'd you know that?" I said, "I recognize the design." And I walked on the campus one time at Southern Florida College, and the buildings on that college looked like Frank Lloyd Wright. And I said something to the people I was with, and they said, "Well, there's the sign." And the sign had written on it, "This entire university was designed by the famous architect Frank Lloyd Wright." And then I got to visit Springhouse one time in Pennsylvania. Oh my. Just a beautiful illustration of how man's wisdom and design can take advantage of the environment and not only make something beautiful, but something functional. See, I've gotten kind of interested in architecture because I've had this experience, and I'm no expert on Frank Lloyd Wright architecture, but I love to look at it, and I've gotten kind of interested in it as sort of a little hobby. And that's true of every single person watching this program. There are some of you that can look at a picture and say Van Gogh or Picasso. There are some of you that can listen to 3 notes of music and say Beethoven or Alan Jackson. Every single one of us has things that we are very interested in, creative things. I suggest things that are a part of us being created in the image of God. And it is these beautiful things, these architectural designs, which we recognize in other areas of our life that is applied in nature. That God has created beauty just for the aesthetics of it. That God has used architectural design not solely for survival, but because He knows we as spiritual beings are going to be able to appreciate and enjoy and be stimulated by the beauty that is built into the world around us. And that's what we mean by architectural design. We have a list here of examples of some of the other kinds of things that are like what we have looked at so far. I mean, literally, we have just looked at 2 or 3 examples of intuitive and architectural design in the creation. There are hundreds. And if you doubt me, I'd like to make an offer to you. We have 3 books, Dandy Designs Volume 1, Dandy Designs Volume 2, Dandy Designs Volume 3. These are articles looking at examples like the 2 or 3 that we have looked at. And these can be borrowed free of charge if you're interested. Now let me remind you of what we're doing here. What we've done is to look at the question of design in the creation. And we've taken this statement by Huxley as the question of whether or not logically the evidence supports the idea that everything is the result of accident. And I hope that you've seen that there is a good argument for this, but I want to make a point here. This has not been a Bible-thumping exposition. What I've been doing is taking you to the things that scientists discuss. One of the top scientists that has lived in the last 100 years is a man by Frederick Hoyle. Hoyle said one time, "There is no way that a Darwinian struggle for survival can explain the emergence of a Mozart, a Shakespeare, or a Carl Friedrich Gauss." Many people in the scientific community, as they look at these kinds of design, and some others we're going to talk about, recognize the fact that chance is an inadequate mechanism for this. As a matter of fact, I would suggest to you that Albert Einstein recognized the difficulties with this. In Einstein's last book, called Ideas and Opinions of Albert Einstein, Einstein said, and I quote, "Religious feeling takes the form of a rapturous amazement at the harmony of natural law." Now notice the word here. That reveals an intelligence. Einstein says there is intelligence. Now he might not understand the intelligence the way I see it, but he recognizes that there is intelligence, that there is purpose, that there is design in it. And look at the description he gives of what kind of intelligence that is. Intelligence of such superiority that compared with it all the thinking and acting of humans is insignificant. See, I don't think you can look at this, and even though his concept of design might not be the same as me, what he's saying is there is intelligence. Chance is an inadequate mechanism to explain the creation in which we live. And he made other statements that reflected, in my view, the same kind of perspective. When he talks about God not playing dice, and as he looks at the questions that quantum mechanics raises and what relativity says, he makes a similar type of presentation. There is design. There is purpose. And for those of you who would like a biblical reference for this, I would like to suggest to you that the Bible challenges us to do what we're doing right now in this series of videos. In Romans, the first chapter, beginning with verse 19, the writer says, "For that which can be known of God lies plain before our eyes. God himself has made it clear to us. For those things that the God which the eye is unable to see, ever since the beginning of the world, have been clearly perceptible and understandable through the things he has made." You see, that's what I think we've been doing in these discussions. We're looking at the things that he has made. And we're seeing the wisdom and the power and the strength of God. He goes on and he says, even his eternal power and deity. We're going to do that in a later video. The unbeliever, then, he says, is without excuse. We can know there is a God. But then he describes the culture in which we live. But they have refused to honor him as God or to give thanks to him. Hence their thinking has ended in futility, and their misguided minds are plunged in darkness. Behind a facade of wisdom, they have become just fools. Can you give me a better description of the world in which you live today? How many people do you know hiding behind a facade of wisdom? See, I think that's an indictment of all of us, perhaps, but of our society as a whole that is very accurate. And I suggest to you that we've only barely scratched the surface of the evidence that we can know there is a God through the things he has made. And in our next session, dealing with this question of design, I want to prove to you it is mathematically impossible to believe that we are the result of rote, mechanistic, blind chance. So we hope you'll join with us for that next discussion.
Does God Exist is an educational program which attempts to provide evidence that man can logically believe in God and that the Christian system presented in the New Testament is the best option for successful living. We offer materials free and on loan. Contact us by mail, fax, or email for a catalog, to request materials, or just to ask questions. Does God exist may be the most important question you will ever ask.